New York, 1956. The city that crowned Broadway stars and jazz greats now turned its sharpest knives on a young man from Mississippi. Newspapers dripped with scorn. Too vulgar. Music for the mob, not for true connoisseurs. His career will fade as quickly as it flared. Critics wrote as though they were closing the book before the story had even begun. But outside the polished offices of editors, something else was happening. In smoky clubs, teenagers pressed shoulder to shoulder just to hear his voice. In movie houses, they screamed so loudly the soundtracks were drowned out. On street corners, boys slicked back their hair to look like him, while girls clutched photographs torn from magazines as if they were holy relics. The contradiction was glaring. The cultural elite dismissed him as a sideshow, while the people, ordinary kids, factory workers, young couples, felt a spark they could not explain. To them, this wasn't vulgarity. It was freedom. It was rebellion. It was life itself pouring out through rhythm and voice. And there, between the mockery of critics and the devotion of millions, stood Elvis Presley, smiling for the cameras, while inside he carried the sting of every insult. The question that hung in the air was brutal and inescapable. Would he be crushed by their contempt? Or would he prove that the voice of the people mattered more than the judgment of the gatekeepers? Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The stage lights on The Ed Sullivan Show blazed hotter than any spotlight Elvis had faced before. He stood center frame, guitar strapped across his chest, the camera aimed strictly from the waist up. Producers had issued their order. Don't show his hips. Too obscene. The young singer knew why. His movements, fluid, restless, and charged with rhythm, were already drawing accusations from pastors, politicians, and newspaper columnists. To millions of Americans watching in their living rooms, the cropped frame looked suspicious, almost like a punishment. They could hear the roar of girls in the studio audience, but their eyes were denied the sight of what caused the hysteria. For Elvis, it was the first time he understood how deeply his body itself had become a battlefield. When the broadcast ended, he stepped backstage into the cloud of cigarette smoke and hurried chatter of stage hands dismantling equipment. He smiled and joked with them, but inside the cut of the censorship lingered like a bruise. His art was being hidden, cropped as if shameful. He tried to laugh it off, yet when he caught his reflection in a dressing room mirror, he saw the tightness around his own eyes. The following week, the newspapers delivered something harsher than television censorship. The New York Times published a review calling him a danger to decency. A well-known music critic dismissed him as a primitive shouter with no technique. Another column in a conservative magazine wrote bluntly, "This is not singing. This is hysteria, set to noise." Elvis folded the papers with deliberate care, set them down, and said nothing to the men in his entourage who waited for his reaction. His silence spoke louder than any defense. But the most cutting moment came not from journalists in print, but from an audience face to face. In Las Vegas, at a glittering nightclub where men in tuxedos sipped whiskey and women wore jewels that glimmered under chandeliers, Elvis strode onto the stage expecting the usual surge of youthful screams. Instead, he met the cool eyes of gamblers and socialites, people who had come more to scoff than to listen. The room was blue with smoke, laughter sharper than applause. He launched into a song with his usual fire, hips sliding, voice full of that southern ache that had carried him out of poverty. But midway through, pockets of the audience began to boo. Not playful jeers, this was genuine derision. Wealthy men shaking their heads, women hiding smirks behind cocktail glasses. Elvis kept singing, kept smiling, his teeth flashing like he had not heard them. But in his chest, it burned. He finished the number, bowed, and left the stage with sweat pouring down his temples. Behind the curtain, he gripped his guitar so tightly that his knuckles whitened. To the crowd, he looked untouchable. In truth, it felt like someone had reached inside and twisted a knife. That night, he returned to his hotel suite, where his mother, Gladys, waited. She had traveled to see him, proud as always, ready to tell anyone who would listen that her boy had conquered America. Yet when she saw his expression, the color drained from her face. He sat down heavily, removed his jacket, and stared at the floor. She tried to reassure him. "Son, you were wonderful. Those people, they don't know what they're hearing." But her voice trembled. She felt each insult more sharply than he did. Where he clenched his pain inward, she carried it outward, as if she could absorb the blows herself. He lifted his eyes finally and said quietly, "Mama, they laughed." Just 2 words, but it was enough to silence her. She reached out, held his hand, and pressed it between her palms like she could keep him safe from the world. In that moment, he realized fame had 2 faces: screaming teenagers who adored him beyond reason, and powerful voices who would never grant him respect. Back in his room after she went to bed, Elvis paced the carpet alone. The air smelled faintly of liquor spilled from glasses, the city outside still pulsing with neon and dice. He sat by the window, watching headlights streak down the strip, and thought about the stage. He remembered the laughter. He remembered the clipped camera framing him like a criminal. He remembered the critics' words: primitive, indecent, no technique. It was not anger he felt most strongly, but a strange mixture of shame and defiance. Shame that he could not escape ridicule, defiance that he would not bow to it. Somewhere deep, he knew he could not stop moving the way the music demanded. He could not stand stiff and polite just to satisfy men in suits. Yet he also knew that the road ahead would be harder than he ever imagined. The world was telling him, "You will never be accepted." Still, as dawn broke across Las Vegas, Elvis picked up his guitar once more. He strummed a few quiet chords, the notes drifting soft and low through the hotel room. His voice, hushed so as not to wake his mother, carried the ache of a boy from Tupelo, who only ever wanted to sing the truth he felt inside. And though the world had begun to wound him, he resolved silently he would not give them the satisfaction of watching him fall. The winter of 1958 carried a chill far beyond the Memphis air. Elvis stood in his army uniform on the steps of a transport plane, cameras snapping as if history itself paused for the sight of him leaving. Reporters jotted down quick lines: "The king of rock and roll reduced to a private in the U.S. Army." Columnists wasted no time predicting his career's end. One headline declared, "Without the stage, Presley is nothing." Crowds of fans sobbed at train stations and airports as he shipped out, pressing their hands against windows, holding signs with lipstick scrawled pleas. "Come back to us, Elvis." He waved and smiled, but behind the grin was unease. He feared what 2 years away from music might do, how quickly America's taste could shift, and how eagerly critics waited for his flame to sputter. Germany became his new world. The barracks smelled of wool uniforms and polished boots, a rhythm of early mornings and drills that stripped away glamour. Among the soldiers, he was just another private, expected to shine shoes, clean rifles, march in step. Letters poured in by the thousands, bags of envelopes stacked in military mailrooms. Girls sent perfume-scented notes, housewives wrote encouragement, children scrawled drawings of guitars and blue suede shoes. He read as many as he could, sometimes late at night by the dim glow of a lamp, the sound of other soldiers snoring in nearby bunks. Those words reminded him he was still alive in the hearts of millions, even if the critics declared otherwise. Yet every so often, an article from home reached him. Smug voices suggesting his absence was a blessing to real musicians. One music magazine wrote, "Presley was a fad. By the time he returns, the world will have moved on." Each line gnawed at him. He carried those clippings in his pocket, folded and refolded until the creases tore. He refused to throw them away. They were fuel, even if they stung. When his service ended in 1960, America welcomed him with brass bands, screaming crowds, and a press hungry for his first words. On the surface, he was returning as a hero, a patriot who had done his duty. But beneath the celebration lurked whispers from critics. He's lost his edge. He won't find his place again, Hollywood called quickly, offering roles. But when he saw the scripts, thin plots about singing cowboys, beach romances, shallow tales with no substance, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. The studios wanted him to be a smiling puppet, not an artist. He signed contracts anyway. Money was good, and his manager, Colonel Parker, insisted it was the right move. The first films drew crowds, but reviewers sharpened their knives. Presley can't act. He's a caricature, not an actor. His music in those years was increasingly tied to the films, bland numbers written to fill soundtracks. He felt himself shrinking under the weight of formula, his reputation eroding with each release. At night, in the quiet of his dressing rooms, he would sometimes press play on a reel-to-reel recorder and experiment. Alone with a guitar, he tried out gospel tunes, country ballads, and raw blues, seeking something honest. He imagined making records that would silence those who dismissed him as a teenage fad. To his close circle, he confessed, "I need to prove I'm more than what they're saying. I can't be just the kid with the hips forever." Letters from fans kept arriving, even during the film years. Some were from women who had grown up with him, now mothers themselves, telling him that his songs were still the soundtrack to their lives. Soldiers overseas wrote that his music made them feel less lonely. In those messages, he found an audience that never doubted him, no matter how critics sneered. The contrast was stark. In public, he was a box office star raking in profits. In private, he was restless, pacing hotel rooms, unsatisfied. He wanted to push his voice to its limits, to sing songs with weight and meaning. Yet the louder the laughter from critics grew, the deeper his hunger became to show them all. One night, after a day of filming yet another shallow scene, he slipped into a small recording studio with a few trusted musicians. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and warm amplifiers, reels spinning softly in the background. He sang a ballad unlike the film fluff, his voice raw, almost pleading. When he finished, silence hung heavy until one guitarist muttered, "Damn, that's the best you've sounded in years." Elvis didn't answer. He just nodded, storing the moment away like a secret weapon. It was a private rebellion, hidden from the headlines. While critics mocked him as hollow, he was quietly shaping a new path, preparing for the day when he could step out from behind the cardboard scripts and cheap soundtracks. The pain of being dismissed had planted something fierce inside him. He knew the world thought they'd seen the end of him. What they didn't know was that he had already started sharpening his return. By the early 1960s, Elvis had become a fixture on movie posters rather than record charts. Every few months, a new film appeared. Lightweight plots, interchangeable love interests, predictable songs. The box office returns kept the studios happy, but with each premiere his spirit dimmed a little more. He would sit in theaters during private screenings, watching himself croon on beaches or in cowboy saloons and feel the same gnawing thought. This isn't me. The critics smelled blood. Major papers mocked his films as assembly line fluff. Columnists wrote with thin smiles, Presley has traded rock for Hollywood kitsch. He's not a singer anymore. He's a product. To the public, he was still a star, but the artistic fire that once shook America was buried under piles of glossy scripts and saccharine melodies. By 1967, the frustration had become suffocating. He confided to friends that he felt like a prisoner inside his own fame. Money was flowing. Fans still screamed at appearances, but he knew something vital was slipping away. Even his stage performances, once volcanic, were rare and carefully managed. The very thing that had made him, the live energy, the raw voice echoing through smoky halls, was nearly absent from his life. Then came 1968. NBC approached with an offer for a holiday special. The network imagined a safe program. Elvis in a red sweater, smiling for families, crooning Christmas carols while fake snow drifted down. It would be pleasant, uncontroversial, and, above all, harmless. Elvis listened politely to their pitch, nodding, but inside he recoiled. To him, it sounded like a eulogy, a way of confirming that he was finished as a force in music. For weeks, he wrestled with the idea. He walked through Graceland's rooms late at night, restless, guitar in hand. Sometimes he would strum old blues numbers, other times gospel hymns that reminded him of his mother. He wanted something real, something that stripped away the layers of Hollywood artifice. Friends noticed the change. He was quieter, more focused, less willing to joke away his doubts. Finally, he told producer Steve Binder what was burning inside him. I don't want a Christmas special. I need to show them I can still do it, the way I used to, the way I meant to. Binder, sensing the urgency, backed him. Together, they began crafting a plan that would shock both NBC and the critics who had already drafted their obituaries. Rehearsals were tense. Elvis, wrapped in black leather, sang with a ferocity that startled even his bandmates. Decades later, musicians who played those sessions would say they had never seen him so alive, so determined. He sweated through take after take, refusing to settle, pushing his voice until it cracked, then starting again. He seemed possessed by the need to prove something, not to the fans, who had never abandoned him, but to the invisible army of skeptics who had written him off. The studio where the performance would be taped was intimate, almost claustrophobic. Instead of a grand stage, Elvis would sit in the round, surrounded by a small audience so close they could touch his boots. Cameras hovered inches from his face, capturing every bead of sweat, every flash of defiance in his eyes. The pressure was immense. NBC executives whispered nervously about whether this was a mistake, whether America wanted to see their fallen idol stripped raw instead of neatly polished. When the moment came, the air in the studio was electric. Elvis clutched his guitar, his black leather clinging to him, and began with raw, snarling energy. The first notes erupted not as the tame holiday tunes NBC expected, but as a storm of rock and blues, the very sounds that had once terrified polite society. The audience, packed tight around him, erupted. The cameras caught it all, his foot stomping, his laughter between songs, the unfiltered vitality that critics claimed had been lost. Binder watched from the control room, heart pounding. He knew this was history unfolding, not the sanitized Christmas program the network had demanded. The executives were silent, some pale with anxiety, others unable to look away. Elvis was not just performing, he was reclaiming himself. By the time the taping ended, sweat poured down his temples, his hair plastered to his forehead. He set down the guitar, chest heaving, and looked around at the small circle of faces. What he saw wasn't derision. It was awe. Even the seasoned cameramen, usually indifferent to the performers they filmed, clapped quietly, moved beyond words. When the special aired that December, the reaction was explosive. Viewers who had dismissed him as a relic suddenly felt the old electricity again. Teenagers discovered him anew, and older fans whispered that the fire was back. Critics, grudging at first, admitted he had surprised them. One wrote, "This wasn't nostalgia. It was resurrection." For Elvis, it wasn't about ratings or reviews. It was about breathing again, about proving to himself that he hadn't been buried under the weight of Hollywood contracts. In the days after the special, he walked lighter, his conversations quicker, his laughter more genuine. For the first time in years, he felt the storm inside him break free. Yet he also knew the battle wasn't over. The critics who had mocked him still held their pens, still waited for the next stumble. But now he had tasted vindication. The silence that had filled his life for so long was gone, replaced by the roar of a crowd close enough to touch. He had stood on a tiny stage, risked everything, and walked away, not just as a star, but as an artist reborn. In the summer of 1969, Las Vegas shimmered with neon light, a desert mirage built on money and excess. At the towering International Hotel, the largest showroom in the city had been constructed almost as if it were waiting for Elvis Presley's return to live performance. It had been years since he'd committed himself fully to a concert stage, years since the 1968 comeback special reignited his fire. Now, night after night, more than 2,000 people filled the theater, eager to see if the king still commanded the throne. When he walked out in his white jumpsuit for the first time, the room erupted with a ferocity that startled even him. Women screamed as if the 1950s had never ended. Men in business suits rose to their feet, clapping wildly, some embarrassed by their own loss of composure. The orchestra blasted behind him. The sweet inspirations harmonized with soaring voices, and Elvis sang as though every note were a declaration of survival. Audiences wept openly. Some clutched their chests, overwhelmed by the sheer power of his voice filling the cavernous hall. The applause shook the walls, lingering long after the final chord. Behind the curtain, band members exchanged looks that said what no words could. This was not merely success. It was rebirth. But as dawn broke and newspapers hit the hotel lobby, the glow shifted. Critics who had attended the shows scribbled their verdicts with icy detachment. One headline read, "Presley offers nothing new." Another sneered, "Living off the past." The disconnect was almost absurd. Inside the showroom, raw ecstasy. In print, cold dismissal. Elvis pretended not to care, laughing with fans who crowded the casino floor, signing autographs until his hand cramped. But later, in the quiet of his suite high above the Strip, he picked up the morning edition and read a piece by one of the most respected music critics in the country, Ralph J. Gleason. The words cut deep. Presley has become a parody of himself. Once dangerous, now sentimental, a shadow of what he was, he lowered the paper slowly. Around him, the suite glowed with excess. Plush carpets, golden lamps, trays of untouched food. Yet none of it could blunt the sting of those sentences. For years he had carried the memory of being booed in Vegas back in the 50s. Now, in the same city, he was adored by thousands but still mocked in print. He paced the room, restless, the carpet muffling his steps. That evening, after another sold-out show, he slipped behind the stage curtain to catch his breath. The roar of fans still thundered in his ears. But what reached him louder was the sound of laughter. Journalists gathered at a table in the lobby bar, mocking him openly, their glasses clinking. "A sentimental clown," one said, echoing Gleason's phrase. Elvis heard it as he passed. He kept walking, expression calm, but his fists clenched inside the folds of his costume. Later, in a rare moment of openness, he confided to Jerry Schilling, one of his closest friends. Sitting in the dim light of the dressing room, his voice was low but steady. "Jerry, I give everything I got out there, every ounce. And then I pick up the paper, and it's like none of it matters. They've decided I'm a joke. Do you know what that feels like? To know they'll never hear me, no matter what I sing?" Schilling didn't answer. He only put a hand on Elvis's shoulder, sensing that words would fail. Elvis leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. For all the glitter of Las Vegas, he felt caged, as though the more he gave, the more invisible he became to those who wrote history in ink. Outside, Vegas pulsed as it always did. Slot machines chimed, cocktail waitresses weaved through smoky air, gamblers chased fortune. Tourists raved about seeing Elvis in his glory, while in newsrooms across the country, columnists tapped out pieces questioning his relevance. The dual reality defined his existence. In the flesh, he was adored. On paper, he was diminished. Yet each night, he returned to the stage with the same ferocity. His body might have been weary, his heart bruised, but when the spotlight hit, he unleashed the storm. He sang as if trying to drown out the voices of critics with sheer decibels, as if volume itself could rewrite their verdicts. For the audiences, it worked. They saw a man larger than life, pouring himself into every song. They had no idea of the private ache that followed him off stage, the way he collapsed into silence once the applause faded. The contradiction became his burden. Triumph in the eyes of the world, rejection in the eyes of those whose approval he longed for. By the close of 1970, Elvis had set records in Las Vegas, shattered box office expectations, and re-established himself as a dominant live performer. Still, he carried Gleason's words like an invisible scar. At times he wondered if he was doomed to be forever misread, his devotion mistaken for parody, his sincerity dismissed as kitsch. And so, while Vegas glittered with lights and his name shone on billboards taller than palm trees, Elvis felt the shadow of doubt press harder against him. He was victorious, yes, but it was a victory not all were willing to grant. The applause roared in his ears, but underneath it, he still heard the echo of a critic's laughter, sharp and unrelenting, like a reminder that the war for respect was far from won. In June 1972, New York City's Madison Square Garden became the epicenter of anticipation. Elvis Presley had never performed a full concert series in the city, and the build-up carried both adoration and venom. Fans lined sidewalks for hours, pressing against barricades, holding up signs that stretched above the crowd. Photographers scrambled like soldiers in battle, flashes exploding as limousines pulled up. Yet, amid the frenzy, critics sharpened their knives, already drafting columns before he had even stepped on stage. Inside the garden, the atmosphere vibrated like a storm before lightning. When the house lights dimmed and Elvis appeared in a rhinestone-studded jumpsuit, the place erupted with a sound closer to thunder than applause. People sobbed openly, strangers clung to each other, and the roar refused to subside even as he began to sing. His voice filled the arena, urgent, commanding, soaked with the southern ache that had first made him a star. Song after song unleashed waves of energy. During an American trilogy, thousands rose to their feet, tears streaming as the orchestra swelled. Some said the ground itself seemed to shake. Even hardened New Yorkers, who prided themselves on indifference, were overwhelmed. For 3 nights, the garden belonged to him entirely. But the following morning, reality struck with the coldness of ink. Headlines across New York read, "Yes, he sells out, but so what?" One review concluded, "Presley is a phenomenon, not an artist. Musically, he is a ghost of his past." To Elvis, it was a familiar sting, but sharper this time. He had just poured himself into a performance that left tens of thousands in tears. Yet to the critics, it was little more than spectacle. A year later, in January 1973, came Aloha from Hawaii, a concert unlike anything attempted before. Broadcast live via satellite to more than 40 countries. A global audience counted in the hundreds of millions. For weeks he rehearsed obsessively, driving himself and his band to exhaustion. He wanted perfection. He knew that more people would see this single performance than had ever watched a concert in history. The night of the broadcast in Honolulu, he stepped onto the stage in a cape stitched with an American eagle, his jumpsuit gleaming under stage lights. From the first note, the air was electric. The audience waved flags, wept, screamed. Songs like "Suspicious Minds" and "Can't Help Falling in Love" echoed across the arena, magnified into living rooms from Tokyo to London. When he ended, dropping to one knee and spreading his cape like wings, the ovation was deafening. It should have been the ultimate vindication. The boy from Tupelo now singing to half the planet. Yet back in the United States, the familiar voices struck again. "Showy, but shallow," one critic wrote. "Entertainment for housewives, not history." Another mocked the cape, calling it comic book hero theatrics. Elvis received stacks of newspapers in his suite after the broadcast. He sat surrounded by them, the room silent except for the shuffling of pages. His friends waited for anger, but none came. Instead, he folded each paper carefully, set it aside, and leaned back in his chair. His face was pale, drawn not with fury, but with exhaustion. "Doesn't matter what I do," he murmured at last. "They've already made up their minds." For the first time, his defiance gave way to something heavier. It wasn't rage, it was fatigue, the kind that seeps into the bones. He realized he could command the attention of the entire world, shatter viewership records, reduce audiences to tears, and still be dismissed as trivial. The thought hollowed him. That night in Honolulu, while fans sang his songs in hotel lobbies and fireworks lit the sky in celebration, Elvis stayed inside his suite, curtains drawn. A few of his closest companions gathered, speaking in hushed tones, unsure what to say. He sat quietly at the piano, fingers drifting over the keys, playing half-remembered gospel tunes from his youth. His voice, soft and almost broken, carried a different weight than the triumphant roar broadcast hours earlier. It was not performance, it was confession. The contrast could not have been starker. In public, he was a titan wrapped in an eagle cape. In private, he was a man bowed under invisible weight. His friends saw it, but few truly understood the depth of it. The critic's words did not just sting his pride. They confirmed his greatest fear, that his true self had never been heard. In the weeks that followed, he carried on with professionalism, smiling for cameras, greeting fans, delivering show after show. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, he replayed the headlines in his mind. A ghost of his past. Comic book theatrics. They echoed louder than the cheers of millions. The Garden and Hawaii had been his greatest triumphs, yet they also marked the cruelest blows. To the world, he was at the peak of spectacle. To himself, he was a man still searching for recognition that never came. The applause could shake buildings, but the printed words, cold, merciless, permanent, reminded him of a truth he could not escape. No matter how high he climbed, in the eyes of those who claimed authority, he would always fall short. And in that quiet knowledge, something inside him began to fray. By the mid-1970s, the strain of relentless touring and the weight of private battles had begun carving deep lines into Elvis Presley's face. Once known for his lithe figure and boundless energy, he now walked with heaviness, his body swollen from medication, his eyes often veiled in fatigue. Tabloids feasted on the change. "The king has lost his crown," one headline jeered. Others mocked his appearance cruelly. Presley, the impersonator of himself. Each word landed like a stone, yet still he went on stage night after night. The summer of 1976 brought more whispers than cheers. Reporters wrote that his voice was failing, that he slurred his way through sets, that he was a relic stumbling toward irrelevance. "His era is finished," one critic declared. Fans who read those lines often felt a pang of betrayal, as though the press had decided to bury him while he still breathed. Elvis read those papers too. He never let anyone see how long his eyes lingered on the cruelest phrases. By 1977, his health was worsening rapidly. He would sometimes lean heavily against walls backstage, conserving strength before a show. Yet, the moment the spotlight found him, something uncanny happened. His voice, though ragged at times, could still pierce through a hall with force that silenced doubters. The CBS cameras captured two of those final performances, in Omaha and Rapid City. Watching the footage later, executives winced, calling it too painful to air. They saw a man swollen, exhausted, struggling, but the audiences saw something else. In the middle of the show, as he staggered slightly, he suddenly unleashed a note so powerful it sent shivers down the spine. Couples in the crowd clutched each other, some crying, not because it was flawless, but because it was raw truth. A man refusing to surrender, even as his body betrayed him. Musicians on stage exchanged glances, astonished that from such weariness came such fire. Still, the critics sharpened their pens once again. Reviews spoke of a sad spectacle, an icon humiliated before the public. They dissected his bloated frame, his sweat-soaked costumes, as though the human struggle unfolding on stage was nothing more than entertainment gone wrong. Elvis read those too. Some nights he tossed the papers aside without finishing. Other nights he folded them neatly, setting them on the table as if daring himself to accept what they said. Then came Indianapolis, June 26, 1977, his final concert. The crowd-packed Market Square Arena, buzzing with an energy that felt both celebratory and strangely reverent, as though some instinct whispered this might be the last time. Elvis shuffled onto the stage, visibly tired, yet determined. The show progressed with ups and downs, moments of strength, moments where his voice cracked. But near the end, he sat at the piano, surprising even his band. His hands trembled on the keys, but he began to play Unchained Melody. The hall fell into near silence. His voice, though worn, rose with astonishing intensity, notes drawn from the very marrow of his being. As he reached the climax, the sound was not that of decline, but of defiance, almost otherworldly in its power. People stood weeping openly, their cheers restrained until the final note faded, replaced by an ovation that rolled like a wave. Even the musicians were shaken. They had seen him in pain, seen him falter, yet in that moment he delivered something transcendent. One of them later said, "It was like he knew it was the last song he'd ever sing." Backstage afterward, Elvis lowered himself into a chair, drenched in sweat, his breath uneven. But there was a flicker in his eyes. Not joy, exactly, but relief. He had proven, at least for one night, that whatever the tabloids wrote, whatever the critics mocked, he could still summon a greatness no ink could erase. For the fans, that final performance lingered in memory not as a tragedy, but as a testament. They remembered not the tired body, but the voice that soared despite it. They spoke of the silence before the song, the hush of thousands holding their breath, the tears that fell as he gave every last ounce he had left. The world would soon know him as a fallen figure, his final months reduced to headlines about excess and decline. But those who were there knew better. They had seen a man, frail yet unyielding, pour his life into a melody that seemed to suspend time itself. And when the lights dimmed on that stage in Indianapolis, the echo that remained was not humiliation, but a haunting truth. Elvis Presley, even broken, could still shake the human heart in ways no critic could ever measure. August 16, 1977. News bulletins cut across radio and television with words that froze America. Elvis Presley has died at his Graceland home in Memphis. The world seemed to stop mid-breath. Fans dropped what they were doing. Factory workers left machines humming unattended. Truck drivers pulled to the side of highways. Secretaries abandoned their typewriters. By evening, thousands had gathered outside the gates of Graceland, pressing against iron bars, weeping openly under the southern heat. In those first hours, the press raced to frame the narrative. Obituaries described him as a pop idol who lost his way, a star of excess who never matched his early promise. Some dismissed his career as teenage hysteria stretched too long. Words like self-indulgent and irrelevant surfaced, coldly efficient in reducing a man's life to a handful of judgments. But outside Graceland, none of that mattered. Strangers knelt in the grass, laying flowers so thick the sidewalk disappeared beneath petals. Handwritten letters piled high against the gates, some smeared with tears, others in the shaky penmanship of children. Families brought portable radios, playing his songs softly, the melodies drifting through the humid night air. People began singing together, quietly at first, then louder, until choruses of "Love Me Tender" and "Can't Help Falling in Love" rose like prayers. For them, he had never been a headline. He had been the soundtrack of first loves, long drives, heartbreaks, and homecomings. His music had slipped into their lives not as spectacle, but as memory. That was something no critic could erase. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. Among the tide of dismissive commentaries, one voice broke rank. A veteran critic who had mocked Elvis for years wrote a column that began with the words, "I was wrong." He admitted that while he had sneered at Presley's movies and costumes, he had underestimated the power of a man who gave himself away night after night. He was never perfect, the writer confessed, but he was never false, and perhaps that is rarer than perfection. The article spread across newspapers, striking chords in readers who felt the same but lacked the words. Meanwhile, television replayed clips from his career, early black-and-white footage of a nervous young man shaking before screaming teenagers. The comeback special in leather, sweat glistening under hot studio lights. The cape spread wide in Honolulu, a single man transmitting hope across oceans. And finally, the fragile figure at a piano in Indianapolis, summoning a voice that defied his own decline. What emerged was not a sanitized legend, but something more complicated, more human, and perhaps more enduring. He had stumbled, yes. He had made mistakes. He had fought demons he could not fully conquer. But through it all, he never cheated an audience. Even when broken, he gave the only thing he had left: himself. At Graceland, the vigil stretched for days. Reporters, who had come expecting chaos, were struck instead by the solemn dignity of the crowds. People prayed aloud. Others simply stood in silence, holding candles that flickered against the black Memphis sky. The air smelled of wax, roses, and August heat. In that hush, the truth revealed itself. His critics' columns would fade, yellow with time, but the devotion of ordinary people would not. Months later, as his records continued to sell in the millions, scholars began to reevaluate him. Younger musicians spoke of his influence, testifying that his blend of gospel, blues, and country had cracked open doors for them. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. What some had dismissed as teenage frenzy was understood as something larger, a cultural earthquake that reshaped the sound of an era. But perhaps the most profound testament was quieter. In homes across America, people played his records not as nostalgia, but as comfort. Widows held onto his ballads like company in the night. Veterans remembered hearing his voice on scratchy radios overseas, carrying them through lonely hours. Children discovered his songs through their parents' vinyl, sensing sincerity that transcended decades. In the end, the question of whether critics ever crowned him with legitimacy ceased to matter. The audience, the millions who had lived with him in their hearts, rendered the only verdict that counted. They kept listening. They kept singing. They refused to let him vanish. Years later, visitors to Graceland would stand before his grave, reading the words carved into stone. He had a God-given talent that he shared with the world. Tour buses unloaded in steady streams, pilgrims from every corner of the globe. Some knelt, some wept, some smiled through tears. All carried the same unspoken truth, that his songs had outlasted the voices that mocked him. Elvis Presley had not defeated his critics with arguments, nor with headlines. He had defeated them the only way possible, by giving everything until there was nothing left to give. His legacy endured not because he was flawless, but because he was real. And long after the ink of condemnation dried and crumbled, the sound of his voice still moved through radios, jukeboxes, and living rooms, reminding the world that legends are not written by pens, but by hearts that refuse to forget.